They said he'd never make it out, but what happened next proved everyone wrong in the most unexpected way possible. This is the story of Jamal Rivers, a kid from the East Side projects who had nothing but a dream that nobody believed in, and what he did with the one chance that changed everything. Jamal grew up in a place where hope came to die, where the buildings were so old, the paint peeled off in sheets, and the elevators hadn't worked in years, where every night you could hear sirens cutting through the darkness like clockwork, reminding you that this neighborhood had been forgotten by everyone who had the power to change it. His apartment was on the 9th floor, and every single day he climbed those stairs with his backpack full of library books, because that's all he had, books that took him to places far away from the reality he was living in. His mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, leaving before sunrise and coming home long after the streetlights flickered to life. And his father had left when Jamal was only 6 years old, disappearing into the night without even saying goodbye, leaving behind nothing but an empty closet and a hole in Jamal's heart that never quite healed. At school, Jamal was invisible, just another black kid from the projects that teachers looked past when calling on students to answer questions. Another face in the overcrowded classrooms where textbooks were falling apart and the ceiling leaked when it rained. He would sit in the back corner by the window, staring out at the world beyond those chain-link fences, wondering if there was something more out there for him, something beyond these streets that seemed to trap everyone who was born here. But Jamal had something that nobody could see, something that burned inside his chest, like a fire that refused to go out, no matter how hard life tried to extinguish it. He had a gift for words, for putting together sentences that painted pictures so vivid you could almost touch them, for telling stories that made people feel things they didn't even know they could feel. Late at night, when his mother was finally asleep and the sounds of the projects quieted down to a low hum, Jamal would sit at the tiny kitchen table under the flickering light and write in his notebook, filling page after page with stories about kids who escaped their circumstances, about heroes who looked like him, about worlds where being poor and black didn't mean you were automatically counted out before you even got started. Nobody knew about this secret passion of his. Not his teachers, who had already written him off. Not his classmates, who only saw him as the quiet kid who wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. Not even his mother, who was too exhausted from working herself to the bone to notice the light under his door at 3 in the morning. This was his world, his escape, his reason to keep pushing forward when everything else told him to just give up and accept his fate. Like so many others before him had done, the pain of invisibility cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. Because at least when you're bleeding, people can see your suffering and maybe offer help. But when you're invisible, you suffer in silence. Nobody even knows you're hurting. Jamal watched as his classmates got picked for opportunities he could only dream about. Watched as teachers praised students who had half his talent but came from the right zip codes. Watched as college recruiters came to his school but only talked to the athletes and the kids whose parents could afford. Sat prep courses. He applied for scholarships that he never heard back from. Sent his writing to competitions that seemed to swallow his submissions into a black hole of silence. Knocked on doors that never opened for boys who looked like him. There were nights when the weight of it all became too much, when he would put down his pen and wonder if everyone else was right. If he really was just fooling himself with dreams that were too big for someone from his circumstances, if he should just drop out and get a job at the corner store, like his cousin Marcus did, accepting that this was as good as it was going to get for a kid from East Side. But then something shifted. Something small that most people would have overlooked completely, but to Jamal it felt like the universe was finally acknowledging his existence. His English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, an older black woman who had taught at the school for 30 years and had seen countless talented kids slip through the cracks. noticed something different about Jamal's latest essay assignment. While other students had written the bare minimum to get by, Jamal had poured his soul onto those pages, crafting a narrative about growing up in the projects that was so raw and honest and beautifully written that Mrs. Patterson had to rate it 3 times because she couldn't believe a student had written something this powerful. She caught him after class one day, and Jamal's heart sank because he assumed he was in trouble, that somehow he had done something wrong again. But instead, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and said something that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. She told him that she had been teaching for 3 decades and had read thousands of student essays. But his writing had a quality that she rarely encountered, a voice that was authentic and urgent and impossible to ignore. And she asked him if he had ever considered entering the National Young Writers Competition, a prestigious contest that could open doors he didn't even know existed. Jamal felt something crack open inside his chest, like a door that had been sealed shut his entire life was finally being pushed open just a crack, letting in a sliver of light that illuminated possibilities he had been too afraid to fully imagine. Mrs. Patterson didn't just suggest he entered the competition. She stayed after school for weeks, helping him refine his submission, teaching him techniques that elevated his natural talent, believing in him in a way that nobody ever had before. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt like maybe he wasn't invisible after all, like maybe his voice mattered, like maybe there was a chance that he could actually make it out of the projects, not by running away from who he was, but by embracing his story and sharing it with the world. He worked on his competition submission like his life depended on it, because in a very real way it did, pouring every ounce of his experience and pain and hope into a story that captured what it meant to grow up black and poor in America while still daring to dream. The day Jamal submitted his story to the National Young Writers Competition, he walked home through the projects with a strange feeling in his chest, something between hope and terror, because for the first time in his life, he had actually put himself out there in a way that mattered, in a way that could lead to real rejection that would hurt worse than being invisible ever did. He didn't tell anyone except Mrs. Patterson that he had entered, not his mother, who was too busy surviving, to focus on dreams that might never come true, not his friends who would probably laugh at the idea of a kid from East Side thinking he could compete with rich kids from fancy private schools, who had been groomed for success since birth. The waiting period felt like torture every day, checking the mailbox, hoping for an envelope that never came, every night lying awake wondering if his submission had even been read or if it had just been thrown in a pile with thousands of others and forgotten. Weeks turned into months, and slowly that crack of light that had opened in Jamal's chest began to close again as he convinced himself that he had been foolish to believe that anything would ever change, that Mrs. Patterson had just been being nice when she praised his writing, that he should have known better than to reach for something so far beyond his circumstances. Then winter came early that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep through the thin walls of Jamal's apartment and settle into his bones, and his mother got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that scared Jamal because she never got sick. She was the strongest person he knew, but now she was laid up in bed with a fever that wouldn't break, and medical bills started piling up that they had absolutely no way to pay. Jamal had to pick up more shifts at the library, where he shelved books for minimum wage, working late into the night and then coming home to take care of his mother, making her soup from whatever they had in the cupboards, putting cold claws on her forehead, missing school because someone had to be there to make sure she took her medicine. The competition didn't matter anymore. Survival mattered. Getting through each day mattered. And Jamal felt himself slipping back into that familiar darkness where dreams were that people like him couldn't afford to indulge in. But life has a strange way of surprising you precisely when you've given up hope. When you've accepted defeat and settled back into the limited expectations that the world has placed on you. It was a Tuesday in late November when Jamal dragged himself up those 9 flights of stairs after another exhausting shift at the library, his feet aching and his mind numb from fatigue. And there in the mailbox, that usually only contained bills and advertisements, was a thick cream-colored envelope with an official seal that made his heart stop. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely open it, standing there in the dingy hallway under the flickering fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and unreal. And when he finally pulled out the letter and read the first line, his knees actually buckled, and he had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. He had won, not just placed or received an honorable mention, but actually won first place in the National Young Writers Competition, beating out over 15,000 other submissions from across the entire country. And the prize included a full scholarship to any college of his choice, a publishing opportunity for his work, and an invitation to a ceremony in New York City, where he would be honored in front of literary agents and publishers and people who could change his entire life trajectory. Jamal ran up those 9 flights of stairs faster than he ever had before, bursting through the apartment door with tears streaming down his face. And when his mother asked him what was wrong, he could barely speak, just handed her the letter and watched as she read it with wide, disbelieving eyes that slowly filled with tears that matched his own. She pulled him into her arms, this strong woman who had worked herself to exhaustion to give him even the smallest chance at a better life. And they stood there in their tiny apartment in the projects crying together because, for once, the universe had given them something good, something that proved that maybe hard work and talent could overcome circumstance, that maybe a black kid from East Side could compete with anyone when given half a chance. That night, Jamal's mother made a real dinner, spending money they didn't really have on ingredients for his favorite meal. And they sat at that same kitchen table where he had written countless stories under the flickering light and talked about the future in a way they never had before, allowing themselves to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. But you need to understand something about hope when you've never had much of it. It's fragile and terrifying because now you have something to lose now. Darius, a future that could be taken away from you just as easily as it was given. The ceremony in New York was scheduled for January, 2 months away, and Jamal had never left his city before, had never been on a plane or stayed in a hotel or worn a suit. And the reality of what this opportunity meant started to sink in, along with a crushing weight of self-doubt. Who was he to stand on a stage in front of all those successful people? This kid from the projects with worn-out shoes and a hand-me jacket, this boy who had grown up surrounded by violence and poverty and all the things that society tells you make you less than. The other winners, whose names were listed in the letter, all came from places that sounded prestigious and foreign. Private schools and literary programs, and families who probably had bookshelves full of first editions and parents who were writers themselves. Jamal started having panic attacks at night, his chest tightening with anxiety as he imagined walking into that ceremony and everyone immediately knowing that he didn't belong there, that there had been some kind of mistake, that a kid like him could never really be worthy of this kind of recognition no matter what one competition said. The news of Darius's win spread through the school and the neighborhood, and while many people were genuinely happy for him and proud that someone from Riverside Projects had accomplished something so significant, others responded with suspicion and resentment that cut deeper than Darius expected. Some kids at school accused him of making up his story for sympathy, said he probably exaggerated how hard his life was too. Win over the judges, as if poverty and struggle were things you could just fake for personal gain. Teachers who had never paid attention to him before suddenly wanted to take credit for his success, claiming they always knew he had potential, rewriting history to make themselves look better. College counselors who had never encouraged him to apply anywhere beyond community college suddenly appeared with advice and suggestions, acting like they had been supporting him all along, when the truth was they had ignored him completely until he became someone worth noticing. The worst part came when a local news station wanted to do a story about Darius and his achievement, and they showed up at Riverside projects with cameras and reporters who clearly viewed the neighborhood as a backdrop for poverty porn, asking questions designed to elicit sound bites about how terrible everything was, how hopeless life in the projects seemed, how miraculous it was that someone from such circumstances could achieve anything at all. They wanted Darius to play a role, to be their inspiring story about transcending the ghetto, to fit into their narrative about individual success overcoming systemic failure, without ever questioning why the system was failing in the first place. When Darius tried to talk about the need for better funding for schools in poor neighborhoods, about the importance of seeing black kids as fully human rather than statistics or stereotypes about how his success should be treated as exceptional but rather as proof of what could happen if everyone had access to real opportunities, the reporters got uncomfortable and changed the subject back to his personal triumph. Then came the rejection letters from colleges, which arrived one after another like a cruel joke, reminding Darius that even with a scholarship and national recognition, the path forward wasn't going to be easy. Schools that claimed to value diversity and inclusion rejected him despite his achievement, with vague language about the competitiveness of their applicant pool and encouragement to try again next year. Some acceptances came from schools that wanted him as a diversity statistic, where he could tell they saw him as a way to check a box and feel good about themselves rather than as a student they genuinely wanted to invest in. Darius felt the old familiar pain of invisibility creeping back, the sense that maybe this recognition didn't change as much as he hoped it would, that the world still saw him as less than despite everything he had proven. He almost gave up, almost convinced himself that maybe the skeptics were right, and this was all just a temporary moment of attention that would fade away and leave him right back where he started. But then something shifted inside Darius, something that came from all those years of surviving when giving up would have been easier, something that came from watching his mother keep going no matter how impossible things seemed, something that came from the stories he wrote about people who refused to let circumstances define their worth. He realized that this wasn't about proving anything to people who had already decided he didn't deserve respect or opportunity. This was about proving something to himself and to the kids coming up behind him who needed to see that someone like them could make it. Darius chose a small liberal arts college that genuinely wanted him there, where the admissions officer told him they were excited about his voice and his perspective, and could unwait to see what he would create. He graduated from high school with honors, gave a speech at graduation about the importance of seeing potential in people rather than just their circumstances, and watched his mother and sisters in the audience crying with pride. That summer before college, he started a writing workshop in Riverside, projects for younger kids, teaching them that their stories mattered and their voices deserved to be heard, passing on the gift that Mr. Harrison had given him when he saw value in Darius that nobody else bothered to look for. The transformation wasn't magical or instant or perfect, because real life isn't a fairy tale where one success fixes everything and all your problems disappear. Darius still struggled with money and doubt and the psychological weight of growing up in poverty and dealing with racism that didn't care about his achievements. But something fundamental had changed inside him, a core belief that his life had meaning, and his voice had power, and his existence was not a mistake or a burden, but a gift that the world needed, even if it did and always act like it. Years later, Darius would become the author he dreamed of being, writing books that told the truth about growing up, black and poor, in America, that challenged people to see beyond their prejudices and assumptions, that gave voice to the voiceless and visibility to the invisible. He would go back to Riverside projects regularly, not as someone who escaped and forgot where he came from, but as someone who carried his community with him everywhere and worked to create opportunities for others, like the one Mr. Harrison created for him. The lesson Darius learned, the one he shared in every interview and every speaking engagement and every conversation with young people who saw themselves in his story, was this: your circumstances don't determine your worth. Other people's limited vision doesn't define your potential, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept the story the world tries to tell about who you are and what you deserve. Everyone ignored him until he forced them to pay attention, not by becoming someone different, but by being authentically himself, so powerfully that his voice couldn't be silenced anymore. And that's the kind of revolution that changes everything.